I'm so grateful to be here. This is my first reading with bangs, which happened yesterday, so thank you. So I was hoping someone would say that, thank you. What I'm going to do is tell you guys a story that's actually sort of many stories. And it's a story that was off the record for a very long time, not because the people who wrote these stories down wanted it to be off the record. In fact, they were desperate for other people to hear, but because of the time and place where the story was told, and then again the time and place where the story was uncovered, nobody knew it for a long time. But before I tell that story, I'm gonna take us back to the pre-pandemic days of 2019, where my sister decided she was gonna take, my nephew was 13, and he decided to forego the traditional bar mitzvah with like the disco ball and the past apps, you've been there, and instead what he wanted to do was go to Warsaw. Warsaw is where our great-grandparents were. I hear some laughing, like what? No, there was a reason. He wanted to go to Warsaw because it was where our great-grandparents were from, my great-grandparents. And they left, like so many people did, without really ever talking about what had chased them out. So although we knew where they were from, we also knew that their histories were really shrouded in a sort of darkness. And so we hired some tour guides to take us around. They took us, it was my sister and her family of 4, my parents, my brother, his family of 4, my own family of 4. We had kids at that time ranging in age from about 1.5 to 13. So it was a pretty heavy trip, right? And we went all over the place. We went to Krakow, we went to Warsaw, we went to Auschwitz, of course. We went to the Schindler factory. We went to see some reconstituted shtetls. These shtetls had once had very rich, 1,000-year-old Jewish communities that, of course, had been annihilated during the Holocaust. But some of these shtetls, in memorial to their lost neighbors, had rebuilt synagogues that stood more as sort of empty memorials rather than synagogues in daily use. One of them in a town named Chmielnik has this incredible glass bima. It's the only one I've ever seen, but should you find yourself anywhere within 100 miles of Chmielnik, Poland, to see this glass synagogue, this glass bima, where the Ark and the Torah would have been held, is quite moving. But anyway, you can imagine, so I want you to sort of imagine yourself, if you dare, on a van going from shtetl to cemetery with kids ranging from 1.5 to 13. After a while, like even the iPads start to lose their glamour, and everybody decides by the end of the trip that they really need a break, which I completely agreed with, but I'm the oldest daughter, so I can't take a break. So what happened was 10 of them peeled off, including my husband, my kids, my brother's family, peeled off and went to the National Soccer Stadium to go check out the locker rooms. Great. But my sister and my parents and I pressed onwards to a place called the Jewish Historical Institute, which is a very anodyne name. Did not know what that meant. We follow our tour guide into this building, and written on the wall in Yiddish, Polish, and English is the phrase, "What we've been unable to shout out to the world." Next to it is a map of Poland with all of its shifting and changing boundaries. Okay. We walk up a set of stairs, and we know that in this part of Poland, or in this part of Warsaw, the streets are a few feet higher than the rest of the streets. Why? Because this part of Warsaw was built over the dust and the bones and the bricks of what had been the ghetto. There are scorch marks on the ground of this building. But we walk up, and we see a big table, and around this table are 60 names. And right in front of me is the first name. The name is Emanuel Ringelblum, and you can pull out a drawer under Ringelblum's name, and you read his story, and this is the story. Emanuel Ringelblum was an historian from Eastern Poland, very educated. He'd studied in Switzerland, and he found himself in Warsaw in November 1940 when all of the Jews, whose lives had been slowly circumscribed ever since the Nazi invasion of 1939, which meant that they had lost their right to sit on park benches or go on any trams that weren't Jewish trams. They lost their jobs. Of course, their synagogues closed. They couldn't mail letters abroad. They couldn't keep a certain amount of money in their banks, right? And so at this point, they had been so separated from the lives they'd known before the invasion that when the call came that they all had to move to this area of Warsaw for the protection and the health of the Gentiles, they went, thinking we've been through a lot before, we'll get through this too. But Ringelblum knew differently. He looked around, he saw that the gates were being locked. The Jews did not know before the gates were locked they were going to be imprisoned in this ghetto. They thought they would be able to come and go. That this was not just a moment in Jewish history, this was perhaps the moment in Jewish history. After all, Poland had one of the longest and certainly one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe. It had this, Warsaw itself had the second largest Jewish population, urban Jewish population in the world after New York. He had the foresight as an historian to understand what might happen next, and so he gathered 60 people, rabbis, writers, artists, thinkers, and he gave them notebooks, and he said, I want you to write it all down. You're gonna write down everything you see, because we're gonna deny the Nazis the ability to tell our story for us. We have nothing left but our story. We will tell that story. And that's what they did. They called themselves Oneg Shabbat, which meant the joy of the Sabbath. And for 2 years, until the great gross action started. The gross action was what they called the first deportations to Treblinka, 6,000 people a day. At the beginning in 1942 in July, when the gross action started, they buried the first tranche of these documents in the ground. And these documents, these diary entries, contained everything. They contained watercolor portraits. They contained lesson plans from the underground schools. They contained studies of starvation. The Nazis only allowed 250 calories a day. Well, what happens under those circumstances? If people can't smuggle, they starve, they die. There were many scientists and Jews in the ghetto. They began recording the result of this on the human body. They buried that in the ground. In 1943, before the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the remaining citizens of the Warsaw Ghetto buried the rest of it. They buried the rest in these milk cans, 3 of them. The part that was buried in 1942 was buried in aluminum boxes. They were not so watertight, so that material was not beautifully preserved, but the material that was buried in the milk cans was perfectly preserved. Of the 60 members of Oneg Shabbat, 3 survived. That's actually a better average than percentage than generally you would have had in the Warsaw Ghetto. Those 3 were a husband and wife team and a woman named Rachela Auerbach, who's quite interesting. There's a lot written about her, and someone actually, nice thing about writing about this period is people send you stuff about this period. Someone just sent me her diaries, which have recently been translated. She testified at the Eichmann trial later. Anyway, they knew, even though the ghetto, after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, had been totally demolished, bulldozed to the ground, they knew, based on maps and intuition, where to dig, and they dug up the treasure. They dug up the first part in 1946, the rest in 1950. But then the question is, where are they digging it up? Well, at that point, they're digging it up in communist Poland. Poland Warsaw has incredibly close ties, obviously, with the Kremlin. And remember that Soviet ideology said that the only victims of the Nazi regime were fellow communists, not Jews. And so there were no resources given to this archive to really, not only to translate it, but to bring it out to the world, to tell the story to the world. So that when we went there with our family in 2019, the 4 of us there were the only people there with our tour guide and with the lovely ladies selling $3 tickets downstairs. And when we walked around this room after we saw the milk can in the front, we saw everything. We saw diary entries written in Yiddish. We saw portraits mothers had done of their children so that someday maybe someone would know that their children had existed. We saw posters, we saw propaganda, we saw all of it. We spent a much longer time than I thought we would spend in this museum in the Jewish Historical Institute. The soccer stadium folks were like, knee-deep in pierogies by the time we get home, back to the hotel. And as we were walking back to the hotel, I said to my sister, there are 1,000 novels in that room. And she said, well, you should write one. And I said, I will not. Not only because the Holocaust has been written by much, much greater minds than my own, but also because I didn't know how to possibly access that kind of material without somehow getting something crucial wrong. And that was more than I could bear. And also I write a lot about divorce on the Upper West Side, this is not my thing. So I spent a year just thinking about it, like walking my dogs, thinking about it. I wrote the first 2 pages of a potential novel, and then I felt very abashed about it, and I put it away. And so what I did instead was just read. I read a ton. I was fascinated by this, and the archive is available online. It's been translated. And then the pandemic started, and suddenly all around me was mysterious death, and there was fear, and I'm stuck in a house, and even though my pandemic circumstances were infinitely fine and could never compare to what these people in the ghetto went through. Sometimes to write a novel, all you need is like a tiny window, right? If you can just see that window and you can crack it open, then maybe you have a way in. And so I decided I would just try. It was the pandemic, there were no rules, my sourdough sucked. I wasn't gonna train for a marathon or anything. I was gonna just do this, and instead of the way I used to write novels before the pandemic, which is I need quiet, and I need good coffee, and I need light, and I didn't need anything. I just needed everyone to leave me alone for 10 minutes so I could get down a sentence and another sentence. And when I was done with it, I gave it to my agent, and I said, without any false modesty, I had no idea, because I usually give my books to my friends to read first. I wasn't gonna do that when everyone was homeschooling. So I gave it to her and I said, look, this is either good or it's not good. It sort of doesn't matter. I'm proud that I tried it. And she read it, and after she read the first page, she was like, is this Poland? And I said, yes. And she said, in 1940? And I said, I know, I'm sorry. And she said, no, I think it's good. I said, okay. And so she gave it to my editor agreed, and a few months before it was due to be published, we got a call that Jenna Bush Hager at the Today Show wanted to use this book as part of her December book club. And as every author knows, you really are more and more reliant on sort of big book clubs to get the word out in an industry where it can be so mercurial. How do we sell books? I've been at this half my life, I don't know, but I knew that having Jenna's megaphone would allow me to tell this story. And what I said to her, and what I'm saying to you, is that now this story is on the record, and I'm a little over time, but before I go, I just want to read you the epigraph of this novel. I would love to see the moment in which the great treasure will be dug up and shriek to the world proclaiming the truth. But no, we shall certainly never live to see it, and therefore do I write my last will. May the treasure fall into good hands, may it last into better times, may it alarm and alert the world to what happened and was played out in the 20th century. We may now die in peace. We fulfilled our mission. May history attest to us. That was written by David Graeber in August 1942 in Warsaw. He was 18 years old. He did not fulfill his mission. He fulfilled his part of his mission. I felt very lucky that a tour guide took me to help him fulfill that mission. Now I get to tell the story. Jenna helped me fulfill that mission by telling the story out loud. I know my book has gotten a lot more attention than it would have otherwise. And the best part is now I get to tell their story to you, and you can tell their story to other people if you so choose. And the story that was once perilously off the record is now more and more every day, reader by reader, on the record. And that's what they died trying to do. So thank you very much.